At the risk of being a downer, have you ever wondered why there's so many things broken in this world? It's all this isn't right, nobody should go through these kind of issues that we face in life. Nobody should go through injustice, that's not fair. Nobody should go through suffering. I mean, why would a good God let that kind of pain happen to someone? Nobody should go through sickness. If you've ever watched a person battle cancer or dementia, or, let's be honest, a man with a cold, that's got to be pretty obvious, isn't it? Nobody should go through sorrow. Watching people navigate sorrow from a divorce or a loss feels so wrong. And most of all, nobody should go through death. Expected deaths or unexpected deaths. Deaths of the young and old and everyone in between. You just intuitively know it's not right. And you are right. Nobody should go through that. But you know what's worse than facing all of it? Facing it with no certainty of what happens on the other side of it. Welcome to the Easter episode of Journey at Home. If you want to help more people experience this content, hit the subscribe button, then click on the share button, and why don't you send this to a friend who might find it helpful? Now, for thousands of years, there's been mystery around the question, what happens after I die? There have been plenty of theories. Most of us today, whether we're a Jesus follower or not, we believe in the immortality of the soul. That when our body dies, our soul lives on. That we all have this immortal, it will never die, immaterial, it's not something I can see, part of us that's housed in our body, but at the same time is separate from our body. Now, this concept was popularized back in the 5th century BC by Socrates. And then Plato came along and said, not only do we have an immaterial soul in a material body, but the soul can't wait to be freed from the body. So when we die, he said there's permanent separation of body and soul. It's not going back to that old house anymore. That was the view of the Greeks. But that led to the question of, well, where does the soul go? So Socrates suggested that the soul finds a new body to live in. This was the idea of reincarnation. You've heard of that. When I die, I come back in several bodies over time, but I just can't remember who I was. But that didn't really add up. So later the Greeks decided all souls go to reside with the Greek god Hades, that you lived with the god of the underworld. And eventually people just called the place of the dead Hades. But that raised the question, well, do all souls go to Hades, or do good souls go one place and bad souls go another place? So they came up with the theory that good souls become stars in the sky. Meanwhile, the Jewish people, well, they had their own theories. They didn't talk about Hades. They talked about Sheol, which was the place of the dead. And most Jewish people decided that when you die, well, that's the end. Your body is buried in the dirt. That's the end of your body and your soul. And most modern people have taken all of these ideas, they mixed them together, and that's what we think of when we think of heaven. It's just a place where souls float around. There's a big family reunion every time someone dies. But all the mystery and all the uncertainty that we carry about what happens after we die makes facing what happens before we die, well, unbearable. I mean, what's the point of pain, sorrow, sickness, suffering, and death if this life is all there is? What's the point if we're all just floating souls in some afterlife escape? Well, a couple hundred years before Jesus, some Jewish people developed a different belief that was based on the writings of Jewish prophets like Daniel, Ezekiel. They came to believe that at the end of the current age, everyone would experience a bodily resurrection, and everybody would then be held accountable for the life they lived and the things they did. So, when Jesus showed up on earth, the Jewish people were divided into two different groups. You had the Sadducees, who believed death was the end, and this life was all there was to life. Then you had the Pharisees, who believed at the end of time, everyone would experience a bodily resurrection and be judged for their deeds. And so Jesus showed up, and guess what? He did not start by explaining what happens when you die. He started by explaining why you die. He taught us that all the brokenness we experience in this world, the injustice, the suffering, the sickness, the sorrow, and the death, he said it's all a result of sin. That God didn't create this world to experience any of these things, but our rebellion against God ushered them all into the world. And then Jesus said, and this is the important part, he said, I've come to fix it. I've come to be the solution. I'm here to explain what God is like, to forgive your sin, to invite you into a better kingdom and a better life. People were shocked, because only God has the power and authority to forgive someone's sins. And the Jewish people, after all, thought, we got a temple system to do that. But Jesus was claiming to replace the temple and to be bigger than the temple. And then he proved we could trust him by reversing the very consequences of sin. Injustice, sickness, sorrow, suffering, and death. Those are all consequences of sin. But Jesus went around during his ministry reversing them all. He healed people who were blind. He healed people who'd never been able to walk. He healed people who were sick. He healed kids who couldn't hear. He reversed the consequences of sin. And then, in the most powerful way, he demonstrated and proved who he was by reversing the ultimate consequence of sin. One day, Jesus and his buddies, they heard that his close friend Lazarus was sick back in the town of Bethany where he lived. Lazarus' sisters, they want Jesus to come, and they want him to do what they'd always seen him do, just undo the sickness, right? Heal him. But Jesus waits, and the story tells us that he lets his friend Lazarus die. And then, after he knows he's dead, he decides to go back to Bethany and to see his sisters. And when he gets there, Lazarus' sisters, Mary and Martha, they react like you would expect. They're angry, they're frustrated, they're disappointed that Jesus didn't do for their brother what he'd done for so many. Which brings up the question, have you ever been angry or disappointed with God? Well, that's okay. You're not the first. And Jesus is actually okay with you expressing your anger. Here's how we know that. John, who was there, who's a friend of Jesus, John tells us in John 11 that Martha has been rehearsing her speech. And as soon as she hears Jesus is in town, she rushes to Jesus to give him a piece of her mind. Lord, she says to him, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died. But I know, she says, that even now, God will give you whatever you ask. In other words, Jesus, I don't get it. Why didn't you show up and help? Why didn't you heal them? I mean, we know God answers your prayers. Why didn't you come and ask God to save them? And as she expresses all this frustration, Jesus does not scold her for her disappointment. Instead, he answers the way you'd expect a religious leader to answer. He says to her, your brother will rise again. In other words, Jesus is saying the Greeks, the Romans, and the Sadducees, well, they all have it wrong. Your soul is not permanently separated from your body. One day at the end of time, all of us will have our physical bodies resurrected to join back with our souls. We'll all be judged for how we lived at that point. But that answer, if we're being honest, is the equivalent of a pastor who looks at a grieving family who's lost someone way too soon and says to them, but you'll see her again one day in heaven. I mean, it may be true. It's just not helpful in the moment, is it? It doesn't erase the pain and the loss. And Martha doesn't find it helpful at all. So she looks back at Jesus and she's like, why? I know he's going to rise again, the resurrection at the last day. In other words, Jesus, I believe what you said, but it just doesn't help right now. And then Jesus smiles and he says what no mere human would ever say. He said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. In other words, resurrection isn't a theological belief. It's not a category. It's personal. Jesus says it's me. You are in the presence of resurrection right now. It's not some future hope. Jesus goes, I am a present reality. The one, he goes on to tell her, the one who believes in me. Now, John actually creates a new Greek phrase here that had never been used before in Greek writing. He combined some terms so that we'd know he wasn't talking about just believing that something was true. John wants to know he was talking about trusting in someone who is true. So he says, Jesus looked at her and said, the one who believes in or trusts in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. In other words, he's saying, you may die, but your death is temporary. One day, you're going to be resurrected because of me, and you'll live on a new earth that I've restored to be perfect and free from all the consequences of sin. You'll enjoy this world just like I originally created it to be. A world with no more sin, no more sorrow, sickness, suffering, or death. Now, I don't want you to miss this. Jesus is claiming to be the bridge between this life and the next, this age and the age to come. And as Martha looks at him that day, about as confused as we probably all are, Jesus simply asks her, do you believe this? And I love her response. In spite of all her questions and doubts and pains, she says, yes, Lord. I believe you're the Messiah, the Son of God, who's come into the world. In other words, I believe you are the final king, the ultimate king, who has come to reverse the order of everything, including reversing the consequences of sin. I believe you're the resurrection that overcomes death. And then, after she declares this, Jesus did something remarkable. He reversed death right before our eyes. He raised her brother Lazarus from the dead. And from that moment on, Jesus' friends should have known that no tomb would ever hold him. Tombs are not strong enough to overpower the resurrection and the life. But they didn't know that. As they watched him die a few days later, they lost all hope. They forgot he was the resurrection. They assumed sin and death really did have the last word. So, on what we now call Easter morning, as the women went off to finish properly burying Jesus, nobody expected no body to be in the tomb. I mean, matter of fact, when his body wasn't there, their first thought was, oh, grave robbers must have stolen him. And then they saw Jesus. His friends saw him. His mother, his brothers saw him. Hundreds of his followers saw him over the next 40 days. And all these independent eyewitnesses, they would not deny it because they had seen it with their own eyes. Now, back to us for a minute, because Jesus' resurrection is personal. See, Jesus' resurrection guarantees resurrection is your destiny. The mystery of what happens in the afterlife was solved. One day at the end of time, our physical bodies will be resurrected. We'll all give an account at that point of whether we trusted in Jesus like he invited Martha to do or not. And we'll all give an account of how we live the one life God has given us. Jesus said that's what's going to happen. And we can trust everything he said because he rose from the dead. So that brings us all the way back to the question that he asked Martha. Do you believe this? Listen, I know many of you have chosen to. Some of you aren't quite ready to, and that's all right. You owe it to yourself to examine the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, because if it really happened, it validates everything Jesus said and taught. But maybe some of you, you're ready to believe today. You're ready to believe Jesus was God in human flesh, the King who did come to reverse the order of everything, including the consequences of sin. And the great news is he wants to forgive you and free you from your sin. That's why he rose and died again, so you could have confidence that that really is a possibility for you. So are you ready to trust him? I want to invite you to tell him that right now. Just say something like this. Say, Jesus, I trust you to forgive me for my sins, to free me from the mess I've made. I need you, and I choose to follow you as best I understand. So thank you, Jesus, for dying and rising again so I could know and trust you. If you just prayed that prayer, by the way, congratulations. How about you tell somebody you know who's going to celebrate with you? I'm so glad you can experience Easter in a more personal way this year.